Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for, for having me this morning. I'm really excited to have this conversation with fellow CX colleagues. And I don't want to be talking at you. So if you have a question or whatever it is, please feel free to interrupt me. Or if you have a comment, it doesn't just have to be a question. So, I mean, if you just want to have a comment, and I'd much rather we have like an interactive conversation. But we're really focusing on personalization today. And when we talk about personalization, the promise is really simple. It's about the right support for the right person at the right time. But in banking, many banks have invested heavily on data platforms and AI, but customers still kind of say the experience often feels very generic or frustrating. And I'm hoping that over the next 30 minutes, I can share with you what my research suggested and what the practical conditions that make personalization work in South Africa.
CX-centric conversation.
So it's how we design for inclusion and how we end trust under POPIA and how we still achieve performance. As you listen, I'd really like you to keep one question in mind, like where do we see personalization delivering real value today and where does it break down? And the key anchor, especially in a South African context, is really thinking about while AI can absolutely lift accessibility and personalized engagement, in SA banking, the deciding factor is not the algorithm. It's actually trust, inclusion, and the ability to operate safely under peer. So when we look at the South African banking reality, you know, personalization is not a copy and paste playbook. We serve a deeply diverse customer base and we operate with the real constraints. Like data is not cheap in South Africa. Access to smart devices is not really as wide as we often think it is. And we're really dealing with different levels of digital literacy. And we also operate in a high risk environment. There's a lot of fraud, there's a lot of identity theft, and we have a lot of scams in this country. And, under POPIA and broader expectations of like ethical data use, customers want to understand like what data do you have? Like what information of mine do you have? How are you using that information? And actually, what do I get in return? And in this context, personalization has to be intentional. It has to be inclusive and it has to be trustworthy. And a simple way to really test your approach when you're personalizing is if a customer saw your personalization logic written on a screen or your payoff line around personalization, do they feel helped or do they feel like you're watching them? So what my research looked at was really just a focus on digital tools and AI tools and how those impact customer experience within the South African retail banking sector. And the real question was what conditions make personalization translate into real customer outcomes. And part of the outcomes that came out of the research is that as banks, in fact, as any organization, it's really critical to understand like who your customers are and not just understand who your customers are, but actually get down to personas in terms of really splitting them up. For every business, there's like savvy starters, there's the young professionals, there's people who are much older in the business. So how do we deal differently with the different aspects of the customers that we have? And it's really important to, when you're building product, you're not building for us. And what really came out as part of the research is that as businesses, we sit around the table in boardrooms and we have this great idea, but we're not actually thinking about how does it actually land with the customer. And I think in my intro, I said that when customers look at your products, they're like, I don't know if this is for me, like you have my information, but it feels very generic. And that's still a big thing in this country is that things feel very generic. They don't feel like they're more personalized. And when they do get personalized, so if you take Checkers, for instance, they had this campaign where they were sending you WhatsApps. I don't know if anyone in the forum actually received that WhatsApp where they were like, hi, Nomty, we see you like chicken. And then there was like a chicken recipe for like when I go back and I buy chicken. So that for me, like at first glance, I was like, oof, okay, sure. I don't really like chicken. I buy chicken because people in my household like chicken. So for me, that felt like, okay. But when I actually stood back and I looked at it from a business to customer point of view, I understood the synergy. I understood that they actually took the time to look at, okay, this is the data that we have in terms of this person. This is what they buy. And if you're buying it, that means you want to be using it. And if I'm going to be using it, what is a way to simplify the usage for me? So if you give me a recipe, then I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Then I don't have to just like throw it in the oven. I can do something different with it. So I think it's really just about not just like segmenting your customers, but segmenting them to a point where you understand in which group of the different segments does your customer fall into. And I think once we really start using data cleverly, we can get to a point where personalization doesn't feel creepy and it actually does feel like you know me and you understand what my needs are. So, like I was saying earlier, I really focused on digital tools and AI and how that lands to the customer and what conditions make personalization translate into real customer outcomes. And it really was to find factors that we can apply in practice. So I started out with outcomes. You know, what needs to be true for customers to experience relevance, simplicity, and support, while obviously the bank achieves sustainable growth and manages risk because there's still the business side of it. So the focus is really less on which model and more on like which operating conditions. So if you've ever seen like a promising pilot stall, this framing is really useful because it helps separate like the technology from the system around it. Because sometimes there's technology, but then it doesn't work and then it gets frustrating. So if the system in the back end is not actually supporting the technology to make things easier for the customer that the tech was built for, then the whole thing falls flat. So I did qualitative research. Methodologically, I chose qualitative because I really just wanted to surface the internal realities of making personalization work or of making digital tools and anything AI related from a customer experience point of view work. So I looked across people, process, data, and technology. I engaged with 15 leaders across CX, digital, and data analytics. And I used thematic analysis to kind of understand like what are the recurring drivers of success and what are the consistent failure points. And I'm sharing it this way because many of the barriers are not technical, they're organizational. So most of the time we get tripped up by like what's priority, what's governance, what are the skills we have. And I think as we talked, as Jonathan was doing the intro, he was talking about like what skills do we need to be having to actually make sure that we're not just customer centric, but there's a lot of there's ease of use in terms of how customers are experiencing us and just how decisions get made. And this method really helped capture those realities in the leader's own words. So then we looked at like where is AI already creating value? The good news is AI is already delivering value in banking. We see it in service automation through chatbots and virtual assistants and in risk and fraud detection, where like patterns can be identified faster than like manual rules. We also see it in like predictive decisioning, like some apps can anticipate your needs and recommend your next best action or like what product is best for you coming up next. But these use cases, like they don't automatically translate into better experience everywhere. So the value shows up first where we can measure efficiency and risk reduction. And the harder part is earning deeper engagement and trust. So in practice, and I think it's to your point again, Sabelo, the question really becomes, are we using AI to make it easier for customers to succeed or only to make it cheaper for us to serve the customer? So I think that's really something we still haggle with. So when we look at what actually improves CX in terms of the insights that came out of the research, three insights consistently came through. First, it was access. Like access drives adoption. If the channel design excludes customers like through data costs, complexity, device requirements, like personalization doesn't land because the customer never really fully shows up. And secondly, trust really determines the depth of engagement. Customers tolerate a basic transaction, but they won't share their data or accept recommendations unless they really believe that the bank is acting responsibly and transparently. And the third thing that was really key for me and is really important for me because as a CX professional, the human part of it is still very important for me. And what really came through is that humans still matter. The goal is not to remove people, but it's to use humans where empathy, judgment, and reassurance are required. And sometimes it's really frustrating when you call a call center and you're met with a robot. And then you're like, okay, but I just want to talk to a person. And then 5 minutes later, you still haven't spoken to a person. So that removes everything that, that we thought would have made it easier for the customer, because now I'm frustrated. So we just need to use automation where speed and consistency matter, and think about moments like fraud freezes, declined payments, financial distress. These are not just service tickets. They trust moments. And a useful operating principle is automate the routine, but humanize the high stakes. So it's really key for a person to get involved. It's important for a human to be around for that. I also created a framework which looks at customer-centric personalization as one of the frameworks that came out of the research. So, and that was one of the key outputs of the study. The most important point is that personalization is a system. It's not one model, one tool, or one campaign. Because when personalization fails, it's usually because one part of the system is strong. Let's say analytics, right? It tells you like this is your next best action, but the other one is weak, and governance. So like skills or customer design. So like if one thing works but the other thing doesn't work, then the whole thing kind of just like doesn't work. So as you look at this, like, don't ask, do we have AI? Ask, do we have the end-to-end capability to turn insight into safe, helpful actions like across our different channels? So the framework is designed as a diagnostic, like it helps you identify like where your weakest link is that is holding outcomes back. Next slide, Joe.
That's fantastic. Who designed this image, by the way?
So what I've done is I put together like what the factors that came out in terms of the research, like what the important things that needed to go into a framework are. So as part of your doctorate, when you do your defense, you have to then provide a framework, because the whole point of a DBA is to help businesses do better. So if you're landing AI or a new digital tool or whatever it is, there are different things that you have to look at within your business. And that's where so if you look at this, like inclusion is critical, right? Trust and relationship quality are critical, performance and risk are critical. But you can't do that without strategic integration. You can't do that with data-driven decision making, because you're making your decisions based on data. You can't do that with customer-centered innovation. You can innovate, you can create products, you can create stuff, but if it's not customer-centered, then it's not actually going to land with your customers. And there's also the continuous staff development, right? At the end of it, there's people who do the work. There's people who have to understand it. There's people who have to explain it to customers. And you need a very robust cybersecurity framework, especially in a country where there's fraud and theft and scams. And yeah, so once you've put all of that together, then you can kind of come up with a framework. So the 5 enablers in terms of like what the critical success factors are were, these 5 enablers are the conditions that make personalization reliable, scalable, and safe. So strategic integration means personalization is not just a side project, like it sits in strategy, product design, service operations, and what investment decisions are we making. And like I was saying just now, data-driven decisioning is discipline, right? You have to have the right data that's governed well, that's treated well, that's analyzed well, to translate that into actions that will actually improve your customer journeys. And customer-centered innovation ensures we design for South African realities, right? There has to be accessibility, there has to be affordability, there has to be language and clarity. Not everyone speaks English, so you have to be able to accommodate people meet people where they are, actually, if I can put it that way. And capability building recognizes that people deliver transformation, skills, incentives, and change management matters. So you can't just like do things and not actually make sure that your staff understands what's going on. And finally, like I was saying, cybersecurity and trust are not separate from customer experience. Customers experience safety as part of the experience. If you ever think about a quick self-check, like which of these 5, and maybe I'm just putting that out there to the forum, which of these 5 is least mature today, like in your organization? And how do you think that shows up like in customer friction or in your customer complaints? So maybe that's something we can talk about. I don't know if you want to discuss the question on the poll or if I can just keep moving. I think I'm almost on my last slide.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, for the 5, what I've seen, but this is, from a UK perspective, probably customer-centered innovation will probably be the weakest point for organizations over here. I'm not sure how it is for the rest of the group, what they think.
Any thoughts, guys?
Yeah, if I had to jump in, I'd probably echo Jonathan's statement just around customer-centric innovation, because that also takes into account that accessibility that you mentioned, Dr. Nomty, around different people having different access to different devices in different situations. So how do you innovate, and how do you create awesome experiences for them when you've got to land them in it's not just one channel.
Yeah. So when we look at those 5 things, like this enables, they enable inclusion, trust, and performance. So those 5 enablers are strong. I mean, they translate into 3 outcomes that matter at the exec level, right? The first is inclusion. The more customers can access, understand, and use banking confidently, then the more customers are comfortable and the less complaints you have and the less friction there is and there's ease of use. The second one is trust. When customers feel respected, protected, and in control of how their data is used, that's very important. And I think we're seeing that in the updated PIA Act, in terms of like, we really need to start being responsible around how we use customer data. If people are opting out, then we have to let them opt out. And I'm sure everyone in this room has received a call, from an insurer or Cartrack or whoever who's like, I want to update your thing, I want to do this, I want to sell you this. We're cross-selling, we're upselling, but none of us actually know how we opted into that. And if you want to opt out, that those decisions need to be respected. And it's really going to be interesting and I think that's why we put up one of those questions around, with the update of Personal Information Act, what does that mean for us, as marketers, as customer experience people, as engagement people? How do we use that? How do we, we really need to start thinking cleverly around how we use data and how we engage with customers in a way that feels like they are still in control of how their data is being used. And the third one is performance, because trust and inclusion are not nice to haves. They influence retention, cross-sell, like I said, cost to serve, risk outcomes. In other words, customer outcomes and commercial outcomes are linked. And this is why personalization it's a leadership topic. Everyone's talking about it because it doesn't touch just the one thing. It touches how we operate. Our operating model needs to think about, what does that look like? Our governance models need to think about, like, what does that look like? And it also looks at brand trust. If people trust you as a brand, then they trust that you're using the information correctly. And it's not just about marketing. So when we think about, like, what are the practical things we can do, right, as leaders? And I mean, I said the next 90 days, but the timeline is your timeline. I think it's really just about thinking about, like, how do we practically, use the information that we have? So I would think if you take one thing from today, let it be that, pick focus, build trust, and design for the reality on the ground. And I think we have different realities. So there's a different reality in the UK, like Jonathan said, there's a different reality, like Lloyd said, and there's a different reality from a product design, like, Sabela said. So it's really about, like, who are we designing for? And that's going to be the critical factor. So I think just think about, like, what your journeys look like, and choose one meaningful journey, whether it's like your onboarding journey, your credit application journey, your claims journey, your service recovery journey, and redesign it end to end, like, across the different channels. And, like, make the data use, like, very explicit, like, really be clear about, like, what information are you collecting? Why are you collecting that information? How is it going to benefit the customer, and how can they control it? And build inclusion from the start. So if you're thinking about the South African context where data costs are high, then you have to think about a product or a solution that's low data, right? The language has to be clear. We have to really start being simplistic around how we communicate with customers. There's a lot of customers who, we all have insurance for something. But when I ask you, what's in your policy document? Like, do you know exactly what you're covered for? A lot of people don't know that. And that's an opportunity for us to really simplify things and really educate around, this is what you're covered for, this is what you're not covered for, or this is what your bank fees are, and this is why your bank fees are this way. Because if customers don't feel safe, then they won't engage deeply. So to close, I'd really just love to open it up with one question. Like, which of the 5 pillars is currently like the biggest constraint in your organization? And what's one practical step you could take to strengthen that?
CX-centric conversation.